Hey everyone, good morning. It is a beautiful day for a walk in Paraguay, and I'm not sure if it stayed in the last video or not, but somebody had asked about what it was like growing up in Paraguay for me as a child. For those of you who don't know, my husband and I were both born in Paraguay and later, less than 2 years ago now, moved back to Paraguay with our own family. We had lived in Canada for 17 to 20 years. Both moved there as kids with our families. So today I'm going to share with you a little bit as we walk through these bushes that we found at the end of the development here where we live. My husband and I both grew up in very different colonies, both Mennonite colonies. And a lot of people, when they think about Mennonite colonies, they'll think of more the type where my husband grew up, which is horse and buggy riding, guys in overalls and women in dark dresses, big head coverings. That was more of where he grew up. Like the documentaries depict when they talk about Mennonites. From the colony I grew up was more of, did wear head coverings, no overalls, everybody had vehicles, motorcycles, things like that. A little more modernized, I guess you would say, but still very, very traditional. There was different groups of people some who would lean more towards the biblical Christianity, some who held very fast to their traditions. Not that all traditions are bad, but a lot of them made that their life. And then you had some who were kind of in the middle, some who didn't really care one way or the other. But yeah, and my family was more of in the traditional sense, but it was only about 30 years ago, about the time I was born, when there was a group that split off of the original church. Up to that point, it had only been one church and split off and leaned more towards the biblical way of life, I guess. Yeah, but my family always stayed with the original one, even though I do believe my parents were more like they would have liked to have the chance to live out their faith more, which I think in that part was really good for them to have moved out. But anyways, so that gives you an idea. One thing I completely forgot to mention earlier, kind of to touch on my family dynamic, is I was fourth in a family of 8 children by the time that we moved to Canada. And this was in a 2-bedroom little farmhouse, and we had to make that work. My parents were never off well. I was always just trying to meet the basic needs, and that was that. I mean, you don't have much when bologna is like a Sunday morning for breakfast type of thing, and you can't just have that at any time. But it was, despite all of that, and living in one of the oldest houses that was in the colony at the time. So that was built to like early 1950s, I would have to say, and it was completely wood, and parts of it were starting to rot away, and yeah, just not off well whatsoever. But despite that, I still had what I would call a wonderful and somewhat blissful of a childhood that I described. Now for school, for me growing up, we went to a one-room schoolhouse where boys and girls were separated to the sides, one side girls, one side boys, and everybody from kindergarten all the way through grade 6. Usually only went to grade 6. You could do 7, but most people didn't, all in one room. I really gotta say, for me as a child growing up, I was always very protected from any, I don't know, adult drama. Every society, every culture, they have their things that just cause disputes and stuff. I was very protected from that. My parents never let us in on that. We just got to live our childhood happily. One thing about the Mennonites is they always keep their kids very, I don't know, I guess people would say restricted. We, for instance, never made it to Campo Nueve, even though from our house we lived like 15 minutes away from it. We always stayed at home, close to home, and only went there when we had to go to the dentist, let's just say, because everything else we had in the colony. Typically only had to do with people who were part of the same church group as us. But even though looking at it from that angle, from a kind of a third person perspective, I had a fantastic childhood. Like, I really do think that the way I grew up, or what childhood was like for me, helped make it easier to move back here, even though we don't have the chance to move into the colony and we don't care to. Just thinking of all the wonderful memories. And my husband was not protected in the same way from all the adult drama and whatnot like I was. So some of the things that I remember so clearly is my parents owned several hectares of land, and they had a small dairy farm of just under 30 cattle. My mom and my oldest couple of siblings, they would always take care of that. Dad would go work his day job. At one point, he did try to start his own business in welding, which never really took off enough. So sometimes to feed the cattle, we would have sugarcane fields. Sometimes my dad would hire and I don't remember if it was a Hispanic or indigenous person, but anyway, hire out going to collect the sugarcane, go and chop it down, load it up in his wagon, which was led by a couple of ox, and he would go and get it to the barn. And we would get to ride along in it sometimes, which was so fun. I know some people would keep their kids away from the Hispanics, the indigenous, but it was just such a fun memory as a child. And then at the bottom of the pastures, there was a creek, because Paraguay has a lot of rolling hills, especially it seems the colonies. They got land that has a lot of that. At the bottom of it, there was a river that would flow by, and then at one point there was a huge storm that just swept out everything that was around it and opened up to this kind of like our own private, beautiful white sandy beach, which was absolutely fantastic. So much fun swimming there. It was clear water, but now to this day, with all the erosion that's happened because of the farming and equipment moving around on the ground, it's no longer that. And people digging out the white sand for concrete and such has changed that. But those are a couple of fun memories that I have from my childhood. And I never even thought of the fact that we were restricted or anything, because we just got to live in our own little blissful paradise. So I mentioned earlier that my dad had always did some dairy farming, and then business never took off for him with his welding. So eventually his cattle got sick, a lot of it, and things were just not going good for my parents. That was kind of like the last straw. And finally they decided to move to Canada. My dad had always wanted to, but just nothing had ever come about it. So finally in 2003, we made the move to Canada. And for me as a kid, I was all excited about it. I mean, I knew nothing of the outside world. Like, we had never heard good of Canada because, well, our ancestors, they had lived in Canada. Our grandparents were born there. But there was reasons, I guess, that people just figured if it wasn't living the way they were living or something, then it was just not good. Despite that, my parents decided to make the move. They felt that was good for their kids, for their family. I had no idea how different it was going to be. I mean, I knew it would be different, but as a 9-year-old, I didn't know how different. But then we got to Canada. I all of a sudden, just being thrown into this completely different society, completely different culture, it was like, now remember, I had grown up in the church, going to church pretty much every Sunday, learning out of this thing called a Feeble in school, which is like a Bible storybook. So being surrounded by that, and then all of a sudden into Canada's public school system, it was like, do these people even know about God? Like, I had all these, like, it just kind of hit how different it was, and took some time to adjust to that. But I wouldn't even say that it was difficult. It just, over time, just adapted and found our own way. And I would have to say that it was a really good experience. A lot of people think that making such a big shift as a child, it can be traumatic. And I would have to say that all depends on how a child's been raised. And for me, the way I was raised to not have concerns that a child didn't need to have, I think it really helped make it something that was just part of our life now. And for us too, with our kids moving here, like, we always looked at it as an adventure and as something new and exciting to look forward to. And it's just really hard to raise our children the way that we want to in Canada. And so we have to, like, looking at it in a dreadful way, perspective makes a huge difference. And so I would say that it does not have to be something, I guess, oppressing or negative or traumatic at all. Now for my husband, like I said earlier, he was not so sheltered and protected from what was going on in the colony amongst the adults. And so for him, he had always said he was never moving back to Paraguay. And eventually we had looked for a number of years already where we were going to move to, and Paraguay was never really on the list for like the first 3 years that we kind of looked at different places a little bit. But then all of a sudden he realized that he had never actually lived in Paraguay. Like, he had just lived in a colony system, which is completely different than Paraguay as a whole. He started looking at more of what Paraguay actually is as a country. Almost 4 years after we started our plan to move here, we have now been here for nearly 2 years. I hope you enjoyed that, gives you an idea of a different lifestyle, and thank you all so much for watching.